Welcome back to Daddyless Daughters Podcast in partnership with Solace Womens Aid. I go by the name of Aliyah Ali, and today I am joined by Olivia. Now, Olivia is an accredited trainer facilitator and qualified domestic abuse advocate. She's also the training and development lead at Solace. For nearly 9 years, Olivia has worked in both frontline and research-based roles in violence against women and girls sector, including as an information analyst and as an independent domestic violence advocate. Olivia is passionate about incorporating the expertise of frontline workers within the organisation, as well as the voice of the survivor, to develop informed training materials that can be delivered to a diverse range of audiences. Whew, that carries a lot of weight and tripped me up a few times, but we made it. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me,
Well,
Aliyah,
it's an
and thank you for
absolute
that introduction.
No worries. Finally, we're here. It's taken a long time to get some experts on the platform, but I'm very interested to have this conversation with you and excited to explore, in particular, emotional abuse. But before we go into it, I would like to start at kind of what inspired you to come into this sector?
Yeah, really good question. So I'd say that a lot of my colleagues, pretty much every single one of them who work in this sector probably has a lived experience. We're all traumatised into this sector. I kind of feel like you almost have to have an experience to be in it, because it just gives you that passion to kind of keep going. So I've been in the sector a really long time. Something deeply difficult, I would say, happened to someone really, really close to me a really long time ago. And I was very caught up in kind of the criminal justice processes with this person. And I saw firsthand just the kind of injustice of the criminal justice system, especially against women. And it was probably the first time I'd experienced that, really. And I was just so appalled by how this person was treated, in the face of like such kind of strong evidence, I would say, and also how in turn how it impacted this person's life going forward, in such a kind of horrific way. I was living in Brighton at the time, and I used to on my walk home walk past this women's centre. And every time I'd see it, I'd be like, what is that building about? Like a women's centre, what does that even mean? And I just literally knocked on the door and I was like, hi, I'm a woman, can I come in? And I just started volunteering with them. And yeah, that was about 9 years ago. So yeah, been in the sector ever since. It's taught me a lot. I feel like I've been raised by all the women that I've worked with. So yeah, it's been amazing.
I love that. It's funny because we did an episode with a previous expert from Solace about betrayal trauma. And although I feel like a lot of us are suffering from betrayal trauma, but not only from our households and the broken homes that we're coming from, also the way the system is contributing to these problems.
100%.
And I just really respect the fact that, you took the responsibility, because not a lot of us do take that responsibility to say, well, we know these problems exist, instead of complaining or blaming. We can all play a position to the solutions.
Yeah.
So I really respect that.
Thanks. I was very angry, so it's kept me going all these years.
It's good. The first place I want to start, obviously, when I first introduced you, it says you was a domestic abuse advocate.
Yes.
And before we go into emotional abuse, I just kind of want some clarity for our community around what domestic abuse is.
Yes.
I know from my own lived experiences and from the girls I speak to, I think we hear a lot about domestic violence. And maybe that's what we put domestic violence under that umbrella. But we don't really explore the topic as domestic abuse and exactly what it is. So could you give us some sort of insight into domestic abuse?
Yes, definitely. And it's really interesting you kind of use these two terms, domestic violence and domestic abuse. And actually we tend to use the term domestic abuse a lot more, because it's more inclusive of like all these different types of abuse someone could experience. It's not just physical violence. And I think this is a real change in mindset recently. So people are kind of understanding that, it can be financial abuse, it can be coercive control, emotional, psychological abuse. It's not just about bruises and broken bones and that kind of thing. So domestic abuse is defined as an act or pattern of acts of violence or abuse or coercive control. And I think the pattern of acts is like a really is really at the core of it. So it's really about a pattern of abuse. and it can impact anyone, regardless of your gender or your sexuality. Anyone can perpetrate it and anyone can experience it. Although we do know that it's a crime that disproportionately impacts women and girls. So it's important for us to understand both like the gendered nature of this crime and that it kind of exists under like patriarchy, and the fact that it can impact all genders as well.
Okay, well, that's good that we've cleared that up, because I did always think of it as well, growing up, as it has to be a romantic relationship type dynamic than it can be any sort of domestic relationship or relation.
Totally. And a group of, one of the most marginalised group that we work with are older women. So like women they turn a certain age and they're just invisible in our society, and actually old women are disproportionately impacted by domestic abuse. Unfortunately, they make up, I think it's like 25% of domestic homicide, so it's really serious. But the thing with older women is that you're just as likely to experience abuse from your adult child or grandchild than you are from your partner. And so if it's your child, you're less likely to get an injunction, you're less likely to kick them out of your house, pursue criminal justice processes. So yeah, it's really important, like you said, that we think about, you know, any kind of experience that someone might have.
It's funny you say that, because I was reading an article the other day that was saying that the likelihood of a woman being abused by her son is just as likely as her being abused by her partner. That's mind-blowing.
It is,
and we don't hear a lot of those stories as well. And I watched a documentary the other day on Netflix, actually, called Psychopath, which was about a son who was planning to murder his mum, but instead decided it would be a lot more hurtful to her to murder his little sister. So she loses both of the children instead of just one. Which,
Okay, would you recommend it?
Yeah, I would recommend that documentary.
On a day when you're feeling resilient.
100%. Because I didn't even really consider how, like, I don't really think I was been so fixated on mental health and trauma based that I did actually forgot about a whole category of people that might be psychopaths, and how do they operate in relationships, and how do we identify them. So I got a lot from that documentary. I would definitely recommend it. Okay, switching gears, let's go into emotional abuse. Which is the topic that I would kind of like us to mainly talk about. The theme that we've been exploring is dirty water. So it's the fact that, you know, our parents didn't have the tools to kind of teach us how to identify and sustain healthy relationships. Therefore, we went out into the community and had to figure out our own way with navigating a lot of relationships. And therefore, we do attract a lot of predators, especially depending on how the abuse that we've seen has impacted us. So firstly, what is emotional abuse, and what are the different forms of emotional abuse?
Okay, excellent question. So often a lot of the women or survivors that we work with say that the emotional abuse or the psychological abuse is far worse than the physical violence that they experience. You know, bruises heal, cuts heal, broken bones heal, but the impacts of that emotional abuse stays with them a lot longer. And this can be anything. So it can be name calling, making someone feel bad about themselves, undermining someone's kind of parenting authority, maybe, calling them names. I think I've already said that. Making them feel guilty, making them feel shame or blame or guilt, or gaslighting as well. Have you heard that term, gaslighting? Which, you know, is such a powerful tactic of abuse because it's so like insidious and manipulative and can go really unnoticed until, you know, it's too late. And I guess what gaslighting does is it makes someone, you know, really question their own reality and then be really dependent on the reality of the perpetrator. So it can be a really powerful tactic of abuse. So that's how I would define it.
You see, with gaslighting, I think I've only come across this term since, you know, we've all been a part of this social media wave, and all of us are having this conversation. As women, we're having this conversation. But I also think that I've gaslighted certain situations. The more that I've looked into what it actually is, I think we've all done it in some shape or form.
That's a really good point, Ali.
Because we wasn't aware of what it was. But is gaslighting only considered if it's from the person who's abusing you?
Okay, this is a really good question. Actually, this is something that me and my friends talk about it a lot, because we'll be like, oh, I had an argument with my partner and they said that I was gaslighting them, and it's like this whole thing. But you remember at the start when we were talking about like the definition of domestic abuse, it's about power and control, and that pattern of control and wanting to have control over someone. So if you're gaslighting someone to make them question their sense of self and their reality so you can control them, that's when it's domestic abuse. You kind of, I don't know, it's very different. There are kind of varying degrees, I would say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. That makes sense.
But I think, like, as you say, it's becoming more in the forefront now. We are more aware of it, and we should try to kind of not do it generally.
100%, yeah. And I guess the key to that is us to be a lot more self-aware.
Yeah.
And to think before we speak.
Exactly.
But it's difficult. It's more easier said than done. And that's why these conversations are important, you know, because we have to stay informed. If we're not informed, then we don't even know that these things actually exist and how we're contributing to the problem.
Totally.
So my other question for you is there a connection between emotional abuse, abandonment and neglect? So is abandonment and neglect considered a form of emotional abuse, or are they separate categories within themselves?
So they are separate categories in terms, if we're looking at like safeguarding and children's safeguarding, you've got like neglect is one category, you've got emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, all different categories, but they are of course linked. I think if we're talking about if we're thinking about this in terms of domestic abuse and like intergenerational trauma and like the links between like the abuse a parent experiences, how that impacts the child, then yes, there are 100% links. So in terms of what I see a lot at work, we work with a lot of women who have spent years and years trying to keep themselves and their children safe, risk assessing everything, every situation, like just doing their best to survive. And I think in a lot of those situations, when your brain is in that survival mode, you're unable to provide your children with or meet your child's emotional needs, right? And so when women or survivors kind of come out of that situation, that is when we need to support them in the best way that they can to kind of mend those relationships in like the safest way, to be honest. I think often survivors that we work with are really penalised by social services when it comes to this. So we know that like women especially, when they flee an abusive relationship and they're on kind of a social services plan, you know, a lot of onus is on them. Like, what are you doing? You know, what are you doing to make you and yourself and your child safe and everything? And there's a lot of responsibility on them, and we hardly put any responsibility on perpetrators to make change or whatever. But anyway, that's why I think it's really important that we actually support survivors as they come out of these abusive relationships to mend those relationships with their children. It's so important because it's going to be so much better for the healing for the child and for the parent as well if they can mend that relationship, basically. I think that parenting can be an extremely like triggering experience in general. Like if you think you've been in an abusive relationship for decades, you flee, and then it's you and your child, and all of a sudden you have the space to work through what you've experienced together. You have the space to finally try and meet your child's emotional needs, and that's really hard, and you're going to be triggered all the time, and that can look really scary for the parent and for the child as well. You know, the parent could be really hypervigilant, so this is when you're like really overprotective, you're kind of on edge, you're wary all the time, or the parent can be really avoidant, so really detached, really disconnected from the child. And these are really normal responses to trauma. So that's why I believe, and that's why Solace as well believes, that it's so important we work with the survivor to work through those issues. So
How long can that process take for a daughter and her mother to recover from an experience like that?
I mean, if it even can, that's the thing. Like, I think it's really normal for children to be really angry at their parent, you know, for not leaving sooner or not doing whatever, not being able to meet their emotional needs. It can take a really long time, and I think this is why, as a society, we need to not victim blame women coming out of those situations. We need to support women in a trauma-informed way to mend that. Like, who knows? And I think as well, one thing we have to think about is that when women do flee, you know, they're also facing homelessness. They're also, you know, facing financial issues. There are all these kind of intersecting factors that are making it so much harder as well. So, yeah, I mean, if it can be repaired, who knows how long it would take,
And it's difficult because my mum was one of those women, and she did access services that Solace were providing at the time when we was younger. And then she did have to flee with my younger brother. And also the moving around a lot, no stability. It's like it took them so long to find a foundation to even start doing the work on. Because it's just when they get settled, then they have to move again. And she was also still battling with a lot of her childhood experiences and addiction problems and stuff like that. And my brother got quite lost within that world. And I think it's had a huge impact on him since growing up. But again, it's hard to identify like what his needs are, and because my mum's still quite stuck within that trauma. So that leads me to kind of think about impact of emotional abuse. Like you're saying, you know, we don't see those scars on the skin. It's not external,
right?
But it must manifest internal in its own unique way. And obviously everybody's impact would be different, but the symptoms are still the same, right? What are the symptoms of that?
Really good question. Okay, so I would say, so complex trauma and complex PTSD is really different to like your bog standard PTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder. So often when we think of PTSD, we think of, you know, people who've been in like a car accident, people like maybe paramedics, people who work on the front line, veterans, that kind of thing. But complex PTSD is really, really different because usually it's multiple traumas sustained over a long period of time, and the victim usually knows the perpetrator. So the perpetrator is someone close to them, someone who's meant to love them and care for them.
And it could be multiple perpetrators as well.
Exactly. If it occurs in a place which is previously safe, and also the response that they receive from services when they report or when they disclose or when they ask for help. So are they believed? Are they supported in the right way? This is all going to impact the PTSD, basically, the complex PTSD, the symptoms of it, and make it more chronic, more long-lasting. And what we usually see is that people who present with complex PTSD, so survivors of domestic or sexual violence, tend to have a lot more issues around trust, building relationships, regulating emotions, developing kind of long-term chronic health conditions, complex mental health conditions as well, coping mechanisms, that kind of thing. So yeah, but there are so many different responses to trauma, and like, it really, really varies, I would say.
Do you think that complex PTSD and that betrayal trauma do work hand in hand?
100%. Yeah, 100%. So like I deliver a lot of training to external services. So this could be like housing or social care or whatever. And what I usually say is that if you're working with someone with complex trauma, before they even walk through your door, they think you're going to let them down, because they've been let down so many times in the past. And actually that is just their brain's way of keeping them safe. You know, if they don't have any of those expectations, then it keeps them safe. So yeah, 100% it is linked.
You know, I have complex PTSD, and my problem hasn't been not having expectations, it's having too high of an expectation.
Really good point.
Of people or whatever situation that I'm walking into. And I've also found throughout my journey with complex PTSD is like I always saw my journey as like I would get to this healing space and everything will be all right, and you know I can overcome. And although I have overcome and I am healing parts of myself, I'm learning that, you know, I need to be a lot more informed on how to manage my symptoms, because actually the more I do heal, the more I'm grieving as well.
Oh, 100%.
Which triggers me a lot.
Yeah, 100%. You are so strong and resilient. Like, it is amazing kind of listening to your journey and what you've been through. And yeah, totally. I think, you know, that's the thing as well that we have to think about, is like not one person's response to trauma is going to be the same. We're all completely different people with completely different experiences. And like, if we put people into this box of like perfect victim, then we're not serving anyone, you know? often services think that if you're a survivor of trauma, you're going to be like sad and crying all the time and withdrawn and anxious. But actually, a lot of people are really angry. They're really annoyed at the world for what's happening to them. And that's also completely normal. And, you know, there's a whole spectrum of behaviours, and we need to recognise that all of them are okay and normal. And, you know, how you feel or your journey, again, is completely normal. And,
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's important that, you know, when we encourage professionals to hold on to a person-centred approach
100%.
when dealing with, because also it expands the conversation for us.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
and we can provide a lot more solutions if we deal with these situations as like one-on-one and not umbrella these symptoms and how the impact that it has. Going back to what you said about walking into a traumatized girl who comes from this background, who walks into a service and has these thoughts. What about this girl walking into her relationships? What's the impact in that area of her life? And how does complex trauma prevent her from identifying a healthy relationship or sustaining a healthy relationship?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I think it can be, for some people, it can almost feel safer to kind of be in the chaos of an unhealthy relationship, because if that's what you've known your whole life, then actually that feels safer. I think there's this metaphor when it's like you're in a sink and the water's draining, and it is easier for you to just go round and round and round and like avoid the plug hole as the water goes down than to try and climb out the side. And it's this thing of like, sometimes it's too scary to actually recognise these red flags and do that work. And it can just feel safer because that's what you know. And obviously a lot of people who've experienced trauma or domestic abuse have had their perpetrator tell them for years that they're not worthy, they're not good enough, this is all they deserve. And so when you meet someone who validates that, you're like, oh yeah, that's right, this is what I deserve, you know, they were right. And so I think that is, you know, sometimes how it will impact that.
Yeah. What would you advise for somebody to kind of manage these type of like, it's like imposing thoughts and voices that you have in your mind, you know? I'm very familiar with them.
Yeah.
But how would we, I know about breathing techniques and stuff like that, but how could somebody contain themselves before they're walking into a situation or a new relationship?
Yeah. It's really hard, isn't it? Because people are complex and relationships are complex, and you know, you don't know if that person is a good person until you get to know them.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is about trusting like your nervous system and trusting what your body's telling you. So if your heart is beating really fast and you're feeling really anxious because of something your new partner has said to you or done, then trust that and validate that to yourself. I think can be really good. So yeah, that's probably what I would recommend.
Well, off the back of that, emotional first aid, which I've been speaking to you about. And I mentioned it with Joe as well on the previous episode, but I didn't get to go into depth as much as I would like to. So could you give us a bit of an insight into what is emotional first aid?
Yeah, I really like this term. Like, I actually hadn't seen this until you mentioned it, but I realise I'm definitely going to be using it going forward. So for me, emotional first aid is about like building resilience, whatever that might look like. And this is something that we do a lot in our training when we work with frontline workers who are doing trauma-oriented work. So how can we build resilience when working with trauma every day? And we have a toolkit that we use, which I actually use in my everyday life. I find it really helpful. So first of all, and this is kind of like building on what I was saying earlier, but recognising when you're feeling triggered or something doesn't feel right, recognise where you feel it in your body. So yeah, do your palms feel sweaty? Is your heart beating fast? Do you feel it in your stomach? Are you unable to sleep, or do you feel really angry or irritable all of a sudden? You don't know why. Are you tempted to go back to unhealthy like coping mechanisms or something? So that's the first one. So you recognise it. And then the second step is to validate it. So to say, one sec. Oh yeah, that's it. To say it's okay and like to feel angry, and it's okay. Yeah, sorry, one sec, I've just completely lost my train of thought. Yeah, that's it. So you recognise it in your body, and then you need to validate it. So just say, like, it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be upset, it's okay to feel all the emotions, and then you normalise it and you say, actually, anyone would feel upset in this situation, and it's completely normal that I'm upset, and this is a normal response to an abnormal situation. So anyone's body would react in this way. Anyone would be upset over this.
So if you was a survivor, coming from a survivor's perspective, in that process, because some things, I guess, some situations from a survivor's perspective, it presents itself to us as danger, and it's not danger.
Yes.
But it's because we're constantly living in survival mode, or within that, fight or flight.
Right, exactly.
Those reactions. So as a survivor, if we was to use that type of system, how do we even recognise if our nervous system is telling the truth or lying to us, because all we grew up in was trauma?
Yeah, exactly. It's really difficult, isn't it? Like, and it's such a lifelong practice. And it's important that our nervous system does its job, like it's there for a reason. But I think, when it's doing it every day, triggering it all the time, it's not very good for our bodies. I'm a really firm believer of trauma lives in our body, and our body keeps the score. Have you heard of that book?
Yes, I love that book.
Amazing, yes.
I love that doctor.
Yes, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. Yeah, it's such a good book, and for me it was like a real introduction to trauma and how trauma lives in our body, and I'm a firm believer of kind of accessing that and healing it that way. So like you were saying, like breathing techniques, mindfulness, yoga, alternative therapies, doing things with your hands, like baking, sewing, cooking, activities like doing, I don't know, like drama or theatre, or like whatever it is, that singing, I don't know, things like that, or like connecting with nature, like even things like that, connecting with people that make you feel safe. Like, I do kind of just think it's about teaching your nervous system to trust your brain and trust that things are okay, and I think it's really hard to unlearn this, because a lot of it is like on a subconscious level, right? But I think the more we practice it and the more we do it, the more we can regulate it ourselves and calm it down ourselves. So
there's also a really good book called Rewire that I use. And it's about rewiring that nervous system, because when you was talking, I was just thinking about, if you don't do those practices, then you're not teaching your body what it feels like to be safe.
Exactly.
And self-awareness. You could link that to self-awareness, knowing if you're going into a situation and you're assessing if you're in danger or not. You can go back to a space within yourself and ask yourself, am I safe? Am I not? Ask yourself important questions.
Yes,
to manage that situation.
Exactly.
Okay. So my next question for you is, emotional first aid and emotional intelligence. Is it a tool that we could use to develop our emotional intelligence? Or is it two completely separate things, do you think?
Again, I think it's so subconscious. I do think a lot of this is about, I don't know, trauma, like research feels like very new, in a sense that people are talking about it a lot more now. So like more research is coming out, and there's just more, like a bit more of a buzz about it. I think it's important that if you're interested in this, you do the work. So like you learn as much as you can, but also like, I mean, a lot of it is so subconscious, and like, you can try and teach yourself. It's hard, isn't it, to link emotional intelligence and this together, because it is so kind of intrinsic in who you are and your body. So it's a tricky one.
So does emotional abuse affect emotional intelligence then? Does it have an impact on that?
I mean, I think all your experiences can impact your emotional intelligence. I think like experiencing abuse can make you a lot more resilient, and it can help with that even. It can make you make you understand like risk a lot better and people a lot better. There's actually this really amazing trauma psychologist called Richard Tedeschi, and he talks about post-traumatic transformation. And I really like this as a theory, and I recommend anyone who's experienced trauma to look into it. It's a really kind of positive, and it's not for everyone, but it's a really positive way of looking at trauma. And basically he talks about how we can have a positive transformation after our traumatic experience, in that we can find new appreciation for life, we can find new meaning in life, we can connect with others more easily, and we can, we know ourselves better after our trauma. I would say, like, a lot of my colleagues who work in the sector, myself included, like, after experiencing a traumatic thing, I definitely found a lot more meaning in life. I found a purpose, and, like, for me, it's about doing this work. It's so incredibly important to me and, like, intrinsic to who I am. And I think that's why I really like that theory, because it's about finding meaning in work like this, or anything that gives you joy or whatever. Like, trauma is such a horrible thing, but it can turn into something else. And
and I guess it does have the potential to be transformed.
Totally.
I love that phrase. So just to clarify, it's post-traumatic transformation.
Yes.
By who?
Richard Tedeschi. So it's Richard, and then Tedeschi.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all right.
Well, that moves us on to another topic, which I'm really excited about, which helps me manage my mental health as well. A friend who works with me at Daddyless Daughters brought it to my attention and really gave me a lot of information around it, and some activities and exercises that I could do in my spare time to dig deeper. Like you're saying, it is a lot of this work is very internal, and us going back in our subconscious mind and being able to challenge ourselves and stuff. So, window of tolerance. Could you give our audience some insight into that?
Yeah, so again, this is something that we kind of talk about a lot in the sector, and it's this idea that in your brain you have a window of tolerance, and then outside of that window of tolerance, so if you're triggered by something and you are taken outside of that window, then you're less able to think kind of rationally, make decisions. It's going to be a lot harder for you to kind of regulate emotions, that kind of thing. And for people that have experienced trauma, that window of tolerance is a lot more narrow. So you're going to be triggered a lot quicker than someone who hasn't experienced it. And I guess what we try and do in trauma-focused work is to widen that window of tolerance for people who've experienced trauma. So give them the tools and the techniques, mentalisation, grounding techniques, everything that we've spoken about today, to kind of widen that and recognise it when it's happening.
So there's so many layers of trauma, and a lot of, like you said, it's complex. All these type of conversations and mental health challenges that, are impacted because of the trauma, I guess. And how could somebody who's not accessing professional support or doesn't necessarily have a supportive network of friends and family and stuff, if this could be an activity or an exercise that they could use to contain themselves, where would they start, and what would that look like?
That's a really good question. So again, I would always go back to that toolkit. So, like, if you're feeling upset about something, if you're feeling really stressed, it's about, like, validating to yourself that it's okay to feel that way, and to just think, actually, a lot of people would feel that way if this thing had happened to them. So really validate it. And also just try and ignore that critical voice. I think we all have that critical voice, and I think it's about, that voice telling you that you're not good enough and that it's your fault and you're to blame. It's about trying to silence that voice, it's really hard to do that, obviously, but try to kind of lessen that voice, and just to be a bit kinder to yourself, whatever that might be. Like, I think self-care is so important, and it's something that we in the sector, like, we have to talk about all the time. We often say that, like, self-care is like a treat. Treat yourself, like, have a bath, have a whatever. But actually, like, self-care is something we should be practicing every day, like part of our routine. It's not a treat. It should be just part of your everyday kind of practice. That's probably what I would say. I think we all need to just be a little bit kinder to ourselves, especially at the moment with, like, the pandemic and lockdown. Like, things are hard. So,
of course. What kind of questions could somebody ask themselves to figure out what their window of tolerance is?
That is a really good question. I guess it's like, when do you notice it in your body? So when do you feel yourself getting angry at people? And what is it that makes you feel angry? And I think it's about really exploring why that's triggered you, that's made you feel upset, and trying to really get to the root of it. And I think once you understand it, because someone could say something which to someone else so it wouldn't upset them. So it's about thinking about why, like what memory has that triggered in your mind, or that kind of thing. So
and I guess, you know, connecting the dots for yourself.
Exactly.
More than anything.
Exactly.
Going back to the topic that we're discussing today, which is emotional abuse. Obviously, we're Daddyless Daughters, and we're very much fixated on supporting girls who have been directly impacted by fatherlessness or indirectly. What are the challenges for a fatherless daughter in particular, who's grown up in a household where her needs have obviously been neglected? Because as we know, single mums, it's not easy to be a single mum, and there's loads of other things that they have to focus on as parents, and the needs of girls in particular get lost within the household. But how does all of this connect, I guess, and what is the impact?
It's hard, isn't it? Because I think if we're speaking about like women and young girls in particular, like we don't live in an equal society. Like women, we live in a patriarchy which harms women actively every day. You know, just last week another woman was murdered on our streets. Like, you know, and these narratives are just constantly being instilled in young women without fathers, or living in like single parent homes. It's really hard, and you know that is compounded as well if you're a woman of colour, if you're a disabled woman, if you have insecure housing, you have insecure immigration status. Like there are all these things which can make it so much harder for young women. What I would say is something that helped me is finding like solidarity in other women who understand you, and also like recognising your strength and your resilience, and also like celebrating your strength every day, being like looking at what you've done, making a list of what you've done in a day. I used to work in like a mother and baby support housing project, and the women would come to me and be like, oh, I've done nothing today, like I feel so rubbish. And then we would like make a list of everything they did, from like getting up and like looking after their child, and by the end of it they'd be like, I'm actually done quite a lot, like that's really cool. And I think it's about recognising that like you're amazing to survive all of this, and you're so resilient, and just to find someone who or other women or other people who understand that experience can be so powerful.
And do you work with people who have inflicted emotional abuse onto others? Perpetrators.
So I don't work with perpetrators personally. So I don't really do frontline work anymore. I mean, there's a lot of perpetrators out there. I do always wonder whether the people I train could be perpetrators themselves. That's always a risk that you take. But we do have a perpetrator service at Solace, and they do amazing work, like behaviour change work. And I think that's so important, because actually that's where we need to focus, really. We need to focus on perpetrators and what they can do to change, because at the end of the day, they're the problem. And I think, you know, there's always this narrative about what can women do to like protect themselves. You know, we see it all the time, especially at the moment with all these killings of women on our streets. Like, you know, oh, if they went out at this time, if they had they went out with another person, or you know, had their keys in their hands, or if they didn't go out at night, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Like victim blaming women all the time. And actually the only way to protect yourself, you know, is to not be a woman, because you can go home, don't go out at all and keep yourself safe, or you can go home and you'll just be abused by your husband or your partner. So there's no way that women can keep themselves safe. That actually what needs to happen is we need to change the narrative, and perpetrators, men need to change, basically. That is the root of the problem, really. So yeah.
Do you think these perpetrators are aware?
So I would say that regardless of your reason for abusive behaviour. And also just to say, like, women can be perpetrators as well. It's not just men, but like perpetrators at large, I would say always make a choice to abuse. It's always their responsibility, like regardless of their background and their own personal trauma. That doesn't mean that they don't deserve help and they don't deserve support. I think it's really important that we support people to change their behaviour, address their needs, you know, their housing needs or whatever they might have. But it's really important that they take responsibility, 100%. I suppose, yeah.
What would you say is the solution for, or one of the solutions for society as a whole? Because I feel like we're all just quite emotionally abusive anyway, to be honest.
Yeah,
I feel
it's
like
true, right?
We've all had moments in our life where,
yeah, definitely.
You know, we've been that person for one reason or another. And it's a lot easier to be that person as well, I guess, with the new social media age.
Yeah.
And the impact of that. So what would you say, I guess, would be a solution for society as a whole to just be better and not be as emotionally abusive towards each other?
Good question.
As what we are.
I love that. Well, it's hard. I don't know. I think kind of what you were saying at the beginning is just having more conversations about it. I think it's about having like shame-free spaces where people can talk about these things. I think so. I've done a lot of like consent workshops with unis and students and that kind of thing, and it's really, for me, I think that kind of work is really great because it's where people can talk about what's happened in a shame-free space and like work it out, and they're not going to be judged. And I think it's about starting young in schools and like having workshops like that. I think that will help society at large, to be honest.
Agree. And your training packages might help us too.
Oh,
Tell
that's
us
true.
about that.
Thank you. So we deliver all sorts of training. So actually, and a lot of the stuff that I've talked about is a lot of the stuff that we have in our training packages. So we look a lot at trauma-informed practice, how it impacts the body and the brain. We look about how we can build like practical strategies for building resilience and in doing trauma-oriented work. But we also do lots of really specialist training as well. So understanding domestic abuse and coercive control, like what is it? Stalking as well. Stalking is really important to understand because of its links with homicide. So I would always recommend, if you're interested in domestic abuse, to also look at stalking as well. We do lots of training around working with kind of like older survivors, or specific training around like doing risk assessments, that kind of thing. So there's a whole range. We do lots of sexual violence training as well. And if you're interested, you can just go onto our website, sign up to our newsletter. We tend to release new training like every couple of months. So if you sign up to our newsletter, you'll be the first to kind of hear about new training that's coming up. So yeah.
Is your training targeted at professionals and parents, or is it something that everybody's welcome to or could get access to?
So our training is aimed, our open training specifically, so the stuff on our website is aimed for people, professionals, but also people looking to get into the sector. So anyone who might be interested can attend. You don't have to have any professional experience at all. We've supported a lot of people to enter the sector and kind of gain that initial knowledge. So yeah, I would recommend anyone who's interested to give it a go.
Okay.
Yeah.
All the training and stuff, like speaking events and stuff that you do, is all through Solace. You don't have your own website or your own profile.
I
where
wish.
people
That'd
can
be
find
great
you.
fun. No, it's all through Solace. So,
Okay.
yes.
Just for the viewers, could you say the website? Is it Solace or SolaceWomensAid.com?
Oh, I actually don't know. I think it will probably be solace.org.
Okay,
but
cool.
if you just Google search Solace Womens Aid, it will come up.
It's fine. We'll include it in the description below.
Great.
For them. It's been a pleasure having you today, and just for us to kind of touch on these topics. We really appreciate you.
Oh, it's been such an honour to be here, honestly.
Oh, hopefully it's not going to be the last time.
Yes, I hope so. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Aliyah.
I remember her dogging my dad out for years, and then all of a sudden he was back and I was 11. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, thought you didn't like him type of thing. And then seeing what she had put up with, the toxic type of relationship she endured under his hand, and then being quite desperate when he was leaving her, she was devastated, and I just couldn't understand that. And when I was 9, I remember the first time that he imposed himself on me, he gave me a whole bottle of Captain Morgan. And I remember being drunk and saying to him that my brother does the same thing what you're doing now. So obviously it was, you know, child molestation, because my brother was doing the same thing, my half brother. And I tried to kind of grab onto the normal side of the relationship and pretend that that other side wasn't happening, and that left some serious scars on me. It made me feel very empty, very vulnerable, very worthless, and very angry.